My name is Jack, and my world crumbled in a split second. I had always considered myself a regular guy, just an average Joe living a simple life in suburban America. My wife Sarah and I had been married for nearly 15 years. We lived in a comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood just outside of Denver, Colorado. Our home was a typical suburban dream: white picket fence, a lush green lawn, and a cozy backyard where we often hosted barbecues for friends and neighbors. Sarah was a force of nature. She was beautiful, with fiery red hair and a personality to match. She was charming, social, and always the life of the party. She worked as a marketing executive for a big firm downtown, a job that required her to travel occasionally. Her career was something she was fiercely proud of, and I had always supported her ambitions. I worked as a software developer for a tech company, a job that allowed me to work from home most of the time. This flexibility made it easier for me to handle household chores and support Sarah in her hectic schedule. We didn't have kids, a conscious decision we made early in our marriage. We enjoyed our freedom and the ability to travel whenever we wanted. Our life was seemingly perfect, at least on the surface. We were the couple that others looked up to, always appearing happy and in love. But as I would soon discover, appearances can be deceiving. Lately, there had been subtle changes in Sarah's behavior that I couldn't quite put my finger on. She seemed distant, often engrossed in her phone, and her business trips had become more frequent. I brushed off my suspicions, convincing myself that it was just the stress from her job. After all, I trusted her completely. We had always been open and honest with each other, or so I thought. Our story begins on a seemingly ordinary Saturday morning. I was in the kitchen, brewing my second cup of coffee, while Sarah was in the living room, packing for yet another business trip. She seemed preoccupied, her responses to my attempts at conversation curt and distracted. I attributed her mood to the stress of her job, as I always did. Little did I know, this trip would be the catalyst that unraveled the tangled web of lies and deceit that had become our marriage. As I watched her leave that morning, her suitcase rolling behind her, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. My gut was telling me that this trip was different, that there was more to her frequent travels than she was letting on. But for the sake of our marriage and my sanity, I pushed those thoughts aside, clinging to the hope that everything was still okay. I had no idea that my world was about to be turned upside down, that the woman I loved and trusted was hiding a secret that would shatter the very foundation of our relationship. This is the story of how I discovered my wife's infidelity, the betrayal that followed, and the path to healing and self-discovery that I never saw coming. The unease that had been simmering in my gut for weeks finally started to bubble over after Sarah left for her latest business trip. There were just too many little things that didn't add up. Her frequent trips, the way she guarded her phone like it was a treasure chest, and the sudden, unexplained expenses on our credit card statements. I sat at the kitchen table, my coffee long gone cold, replaying the events of the past few weeks in my mind. Sarah had always been busy with work, but lately it felt like she was more absent than present. She'd come home late, tired and irritable, and our conversations had become superficial, almost forced. There was also the way she had become increasingly secretive with her phone. She used to leave it lying around the house, but now it was always within arm's reach, and she never let it out of her sight. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen her without it clutched in her hand or tucked into her pocket. And then there were the business trips. They had started becoming more frequent, often with little to no notice. I used to look forward to those few days of solitude, but now they filled me with a sense of dread. Each time she left, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was running away from something, or someone. I decided to take a closer look at her recent trips. I pulled up our shared calendar and noted down the dates and locations of her business trips over the past few months. It didn't take long to see a pattern. She was traveling to the same cities, often staying at the same hotels. It was too consistent to be coincidental. One evening, after Sarah had gone to bed, I found myself unable to sleep. I slipped out of bed quietly and made my way to the living room. I grabbed her laptop, which she often left on the coffee table, and powered it up. My hands trembled as I navigated through her emails, feeling a pang of guilt for invading her privacy. But the need to know the truth outweighed my conscience. It didn't take long to find something suspicious. Among the mundane work emails and newsletters, there were messages from someone named Brad. The emails were cleverly disguised as work-related, But reading between the lines, it was clear there was more going on. The messages were flirty, filled with inside jokes and suggestive comments. My heart pounded as I scrolled through the emails, each one a dagger to my heart. I spent the next few days in a daze, trying to act normal while my mind raced with suspicion and doubt. Sarah continued to go about her routine, seemingly oblivious to the turmoil brewing inside me. I couldn't confront her without solid proof, but I couldn't ignore the growing evidence either. One evening, Sarah mentioned she had to go out for a business dinner. This wasn't unusual, but something about the way she said it made my skin crawl. She avoided eye contact and fumbled with her words, like she was hiding something. My gut told me this was my chance to find out what was really going on. After she left, I waited for a few minutes before grabbing my keys and heading out. I knew which restaurant she was going to. She had mentioned it in passing during dinner. I drove there, parking a few blocks away so she wouldn't see my car. My heart pounded in my chest as I walked towards the restaurant, trying to stay out of sight. I positioned myself outside, peering through the large windows into the dining area. It didn't take long to spot her. She was sitting at a table near the back, laughing and chatting animatedly with a man who could only be Brad. They were sitting too close for it to be a purely professional meeting. My suspicions were confirmed. I felt a mix of rage and heartbreak as I watched them. The woman I loved, the woman I had trusted for years, was betraying me in the most painful way imaginable. But I couldn't just barge in and confront her. Not yet. I needed more evidence, something undeniable that she couldn't talk her way out of. I snapped a few pictures with my phone, capturing the intimate moment between Sarah and Brad. Then I turned and walked back to my car, my mind racing with what to do next. The time for confrontation was coming, but I needed to be prepared. This was just the beginning of uncovering the truth about my wife's infidelity, and I needed to gather all the pieces before I could confront her. Back at home, I sat down and started formulating a plan. I knew I needed to dig deeper, to find out the full extent of Sarah's betrayal. I was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The woman I thought I knew, the life I thought we had built together, was starting to crumble, and I needed to be ready for what came next. I sat in the living room, my mind a storm of emotions. I tried to distract myself with the TV, but nothing could pull me away from the thoughts gnawing at my sanity. The house felt colder, emptier, knowing what Sarah was doing behind my back. As the hours ticked by, my anxiety grew. Around midnight, I heard the front door open. Sarah stumbled in, giggling, with Brad following close behind. They didn't see me in the darkened living room, assuming I was asleep. I stayed still, watching as they made their way into the house. Sarah's laughter was tinged with drunkenness, and she clung to Brad as they staggered into the living room. "Shh," she whispered loudly. "Jack's probably asleep. We need to be quiet." Brad laughed, pulling her close. "Don't worry, babe. He's probably snoring away by now." They started kissing, their hands roaming each other's bodies with a familiarity that made my stomach churn. I felt my hands clench into fists, my nails digging into my palms. The sight of my wife in the arms of another man, in our home, was too much to bear. Sarah pushed Brad onto the couch and they began undressing each other, their movements urgent and unrestrained. My rage built with every piece of clothing that hit the floor. This was the woman I had loved and trusted, the woman I had shared my life with for 15 years, now shamelessly betraying me in our own living room. Unable to contain my anger any longer, I stood up, casting a shadow over them. The sound of my footsteps made them freeze. Sarah turned, her eyes widening in shock as she saw me standing there. "Jack!" she gasped, scrambling to cover herself with a throw pillow. Brad jumped up, fumbling with his pants. I can explain," he stammered, his face pale. I didn't give him a chance. I lunged at him, fueled by a mix of anger and adrenaline. My fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling back onto the couch. Sarah screamed, trying to pull me off him, but I shoved her away, focusing all my rage on the man who had dared to touch my wife. "Get out!" I roared, landing another punch on Brad. "Get out of my house!" Brad scrambled to his feet, his face bloodied and bruised. He grabbed his clothes, backing away from me with fear in his eyes. I'm going, he yelled, stumbling towards the door. I followed him, making sure he left, then slammed the door behind him. My chest heaved with exertion and rage. I turned back to Sarah, who was sitting on the couch, clutching the throw pillow to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "How could you?" I shouted, my voice breaking. "How could you do this to me, to us?" Sarah sobbed, trying to gather herself. "Jack, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for you to find out this way." "Find out?" I scoffed. "You brought him into our home, Sarah. You didn't even care if I found out. You thought I was asleep and just went ahead with it. How long has this been going on?" She hesitated, looking down at her hands. "A few months," she admitted quietly. "A few months?" I repeated, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. "You've been lying to me for months, sneaking around with him, and I didn't see it. I trusted you, Sarah. I loved you." She broke down, crying harder. "I was lonely, Jack. You're always working, always busy. I needed someone, and Brad was there. It just happened. It just happened." I shook my head, unable to comprehend her excuses. "No, Sarah. This didn't just happen. You made a choice. You chose to betray me." I stood there, staring at the woman I thought I knew, feeling like my entire life had been a lie. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I had ever felt. I couldn't look at her anymore. Couldn't stand to be in the same room. "I can't do this right now," I said, my voice hollow. "I need to get out of here." I grabbed my keys and walked out the door, leaving Sarah sobbing on the couch. As I drove aimlessly through the night, the weight of what had happened settled over me. My marriage, my life, everything I thought I knew was falling apart. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. I couldn't go back to the way things were. This was a turning point, and I needed to find a way to move forward, no matter how painful it would be. The night I left Sarah sobbing on the couch felt endless. I drove aimlessly through the dark, the city lights blurring past as I tried to process what had just happened. The raw betrayal, the sight of her with Brad in our living room, it was all too much to bear. Eventually, I pulled over into an empty parking lot, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I fought to regain control of my emotions. Hours passed before I felt ready to return home. I dreaded facing Sarah, but I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. As I walked through the front door, the silence of the house was deafening. Sarah was still on the couch, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She looked up as I entered, her expression a mix of guilt and desperation. "Jack," she whispered, her voice trembling, "can we please talk?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Fine, talk." She wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. "I'm so sorry for what happened tonight. I never meant for things to get this out of hand." "Out of hand?" I repeated, my anger simmering just beneath the surface. "You brought him into our home, Sarah. You were fucking him on our couch. That's more than just out of hand." She flinched at my words but pressed on. "I know, and I take full responsibility for that. But you have to understand, Jack. I've been so lonely. You've been so distant, always working, always preoccupied. I needed someone to talk to, someone who made me feel wanted." "So you chose to cheat on me?" I shot back. "You could have talked to me, told me how you were feeling. Instead, you lied to me, betrayed me." Tears streamed down her face. "I did try to talk to you, but you never listened. You were always too busy with work. And then Brad came along, and he listened. He was there for me in a way you weren't." I shook my head, the pain of her words cutting deep. "So, this is my fault? You're blaming me for your infidelity?" "No, that's not what I'm saying," she said quickly. "I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. But you have to see how we got here. Our marriage has been falling apart for a long time." I felt a bitter laugh escape my lips. "So your solution was to destroy it completely? To betray me in the worst possible way?" She looked down, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "I know I've hurt you, Jack. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But please, can we try to fix this? Can we at least try to talk things through?" I stared at her, the woman I had loved for 15 years, now reduced to a stranger who had ripped my heart out. Part of me wanted to believe her, to think that we could somehow salvage our broken marriage. But the other part, the part that had witnessed her betrayal firsthand, knew that things could never be the same. "I don't know if I can, Sarah," I said quietly. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again." She reached out, her hand trembling as she placed it on mine. "Please, Jack. I know I've made a mess of things, but I love you. I don't want to lose you." I pulled my hand away, unable to bear her touch. Love? You say you love me, but you slept with another man in our home. How can you claim to love me and do something like that? She broke down completely, her sobs filling the room. I'm so sorry, Jack. I'm so sorry. I stood up, needing to put some distance between us. I need time to think, Sarah. I need to figure out if I can even begin to forgive you. Right now, I just need some space. She nodded, tears still streaming down her face. Take all the time you need. I'll do anything to make this right. I left her there, retreating to the guest bedroom and locking the door behind me. As I lay on the unfamiliar bed, the weight of the night's events pressed down on me. The woman I thought I knew, the life I thought we had built together, was shattered. The road to forgiveness, if there was one, seemed impossibly long and fraught with pain. The next few days were a blur of awkward silences and forced politeness. Sarah tried to give me space, but her presence in the house was a constant reminder of her betrayal. I found myself avoiding her, retreating to the guest room and drowning myself in work to escape the painful reality. One evening, Sarah knocked on the guest room door. Jack, can we please talk again? I sighed, knowing we couldn't avoid this conversation forever. Come in. She entered hesitantly, her eyes filled with sorrow. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how I've hurt you. I know I can't undo what I've done, but I want to try to make things right. I looked at her, my heart heavy with conflicting emotions. How do you propose we do that, Sarah? How do we move past something like this? She sat down on the edge of the bed, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I think we need to see a therapist, someone who can help us navigate through this. We've both made mistakes, and we need to find a way to communicate better, to understand each other. A therapist? I asked, skepticism evident in my voice. You think talking to a stranger can fix this? I don't know, she admitted. But we have to try, don't we? We owe it to ourselves, to our marriage, to at least try. I looked away, struggling with my thoughts. Part of me wanted to believe that therapy could help, that we could somehow rebuild what had been broken. But the pain of her betrayal was still fresh, and the thought of sitting in a room, rehashing our problems with a stranger, seemed unbearable. Maybe, I said finally, but it's going to take more than just talking to someone, Sarah. Trust is something that has to be rebuilt, and right now, I don't know if I can ever trust you again. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes once more. I understand, Jack, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn back your trust. Please, just give us a chance. I sighed, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. I'll think about it, Sarah, but right now I need more time. She nodded again, her expression filled with a mixture of hope and despair. Take all the time you need. I'll be here, waiting, hoping we can find a way through this. As she left the room, I lay back on the bed staring at the ceiling. The path to healing and forgiveness seemed impossibly long and fraught with uncertainty. But one thing was clear: whatever happened next, our lives would never be the same. The following weeks were a blur of tension and awkward silences. I continued to avoid Sarah, burying myself in work and spending long hours out of the house. The nights were the hardest, lying in the guest bedroom, my mind racing with thoughts of her betrayal. The anger and pain simmered just beneath the surface, and I found myself plotting ways to make her feel the hurt she had inflicted on me. The idea of revenge took hold, growing stronger with each passing day. Sarah had destroyed our marriage, shattered my trust, and made a mockery of our life together. She needed to understand the depth of my pain, to feel the same anguish and betrayal. And Brad, the bastard who had wormed his way into my life and stolen my wife, he needed to suffer too. One evening, as I sat in the guest room, an idea began to form. It was cruel, vindictive, and perfectly fitting for the situation. I would hit Sarah where it hurt the most: her job and her reputation. She had always prided herself on her career, and it was time to dismantle the facade she had built. I started by gathering all the evidence of her infidelity. The photos I had taken at the restaurant, the emails I had found on her laptop, and even a few text messages I had managed to retrieve from her phone. I compiled everything into a neat, damning package. Next, I created an anonymous email account and sent the evidence to her boss, along with a detailed explanation of her affair with Brad, who also worked at the same company. The next morning, I watched Sarah leave for work, blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to hit. I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction as I imagined the fallout. Her career would be in ruins, her reputation tarnished, and Brad would be dragged down with her. That evening, Sarah came home late, her face pale and drawn. She barely looked at me as she walked past, heading straight for the bedroom. I followed her, my heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and dread. "What's wrong, Sarah?" I asked, feigning concern. She turned to me, her eyes filled with tears. "I lost my job, Jack. They fired me." I raised an eyebrow, pretending to be shocked. "Why? What happened?" "Someone sent my boss an email," she said, her voice shaking. "They had pictures, emails, everything. They know about Brad and me. Brad got fired too." I felt a surge of triumph, but kept my expression neutral. "I'm sorry to hear that, Sarah. But maybe this is a sign. Maybe it's time to focus on fixing our marriage." She looked at me, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "Do you really mean that, Jack? Do you think we can still fix this?" I nodded, maintaining the charade. "I think we can try. But you need to understand the consequences of your actions. You need to see what your betrayal has done." Over the next few days, I watched as Sarah struggled to cope with the loss of her job. Her confidence shattered. She became a shadow of her former self, withdrawn and depressed. I continued to act supportive, all the while relishing the sight of her suffering. But my revenge didn't stop there. I needed to make sure Brad felt the full extent of my wrath. I tracked down his home address and paid him a visit one evening. He lived in a modest apartment on the other side of town, and it didn't take long to find his door. When he answered, his face paled at the sight of me. "Jack," he stammered. "What are you doing here?" I didn't waste any time. I shoved him back into his apartment, slamming the door behind me. "You thought you could fuck my wife and get away with it?" I snarled. He backed away, fear in his eyes. "Look, I'm sorry, man. I didn't mean for things to get out of hand." "Sorry," I laughed, a cold, bitter sound. "You ruined my marriage. You destroyed my life. And now you're going to pay." I grabbed him by the collar and threw him against the wall. "I lost my job because of you!" he cried, desperation in his voice. "Isn't that enough?" "No," I hissed. "It's not nearly enough." I beat him mercilessly, venting all my pent-up rage and frustration. By the time I was done, he was a bloodied, whimpering mess on the floor. I stood over him, my chest heaving with exertion. "If you ever come near Sarah again," I spat, "I will kill you." I left him there, satisfied that I had exacted my revenge. As I drove home, a dark sense of satisfaction settled over me. Sarah and Brad had both paid the price for their betrayal, and I felt a twisted sense of justice. When I returned home, Sarah was sitting in the living room, her eyes red from crying. She looked up at me, a mixture of fear and hope in her gaze. "Jack, where have you been?" I shrugged, keeping my tone casual. "Just went for a drive. Needed to clear my head." She nodded, biting her lip. "I've been thinking about what you said, about fixing our marriage. I want to try, Jack. I really do." I sat down next to her, taking her hand in mine. "Then let's start working on it, Sarah. Let's rebuild what we lost." As we sat there, the house filled with a tense, uneasy silence. The path to reconciliation was uncertain, but I knew one thing for sure. Sarah would never forget the consequences of her betrayal, and I would never let her forget it. In the days that followed, Sarah and I made a tentative attempt to rebuild our shattered relationship. Despite the facade of reconciliation, my anger and mistrust simmered beneath the surface. We started seeing a therapist, Dr. Collins, who specialized in couples dealing with infidelity. Each session was a painful excavation of our past, our grievances, and the betrayal that had torn us apart. Dr. Collins encouraged open and honest communication, urging us to express our feelings without fear of judgment. Sarah tearfully admitted her loneliness, her resentment towards my work habits, and how she felt neglected and unloved. I, in turn, voiced my pain, my sense of betrayal, and the rage that had consumed me since discovering her affair. Despite our efforts, the sessions often devolved into arguments. The wounds were too fresh, the betrayal too deep. Sarah's attempts to apologize and explain her actions only fueled my anger. Her words felt hollow, her remorse insincere. I couldn't shake the image of her and Brad in our living room, the sound of their laughter echoing in my mind. One evening, after a particularly heated therapy session, We returned home in silence. The tension was palpable, a thick, suffocating presence that neither of us could escape. I retreated to the guest bedroom while Sarah went to our room. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the realization hit me with crushing clarity. This wasn't going to work. The trust was gone, replaced by a festering wound that refused to heal. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't continue living like this, trapped in a cycle of anger and resentment. I needed to move on, to find some semblance of peace. It was time to end our marriage. I approached Sarah in the kitchen, my heart heavy but resolute. "Sarah, we need to talk." She looked up, her eyes red from lack of sleep. "What is it, Jack?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. "I think it's time for us to end this. We can't keep going like this. The trust is gone, and I don't see a way to rebuild it." Her face crumpled, and she looked away, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Jack, please. We can still try. We can keep going to therapy, keep working on this." I shook my head, my voice firm. "It's not working, Sarah. We both know it. This isn't a marriage anymore. It's a prison. We're both miserable, and it's only going to get worse." She sobbed, her shoulders shaking. "I don't want to lose you. I love you, Jack. I know I made a terrible mistake, but I want to make it right." "I loved you too," I said quietly, the past tense hanging heavily in the air. "But I can't forget what you did. Every time I look at you, I see the betrayal. It's tearing me apart." She reached out, her hand trembling. "Please, Jack, just give me one more chance." I pulled away, my heart breaking. "I can't, Sarah. I'm sorry. I've already contacted a lawyer. We're getting a divorce." Her sobs grew louder, but I steeled myself against the sound. I couldn't afford to be swayed by her tears, not when I knew this was the right decision for both of us. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and paperwork. I hired Marcia, the ruthless lawyer I had consulted earlier. She was efficient and unyielding, ensuring that my interests were protected. Sarah, on the other hand, was devastated. She hired a lawyer too, but her heart wasn't in the fight. She seemed resigned to the inevitability of our divorce. We divided our assets, sold the house, and split the proceeds. The process was painful, a constant reminder of the life we had built together and the dreams that had been shattered. Friends and family were shocked, some siding with me, others with Sarah. It was a messy, emotional ordeal, but I knew it was the only way forward. On the day we signed the final divorce papers, Sarah and I met at the lawyer's office. The atmosphere was somber, the weight of our failed marriage hanging heavily between us. Marcia handed me the papers, her expression professional and detached. Sarah's lawyer did the same. As I signed my name, a flood of memories washed over me. Our wedding day, the vacations we had taken, the quiet evenings spent together. It was all over now, reduced to a few signatures on a piece of paper. When it was Sarah's turn to sign, she hesitated, looking up at me with tear-filled eyes. "Jack, are you sure about this? There's no going back after this." I nodded, my resolve firm. "I'm sure, Sarah. This is the right thing to do." She signed the papers, her hands shaking. When she was done, she looked at me one last time. "I hope you find happiness, Jack. I really do." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my emotions in check. "I hope you do too, Sarah." With that, we stood up and left the office, going our separate ways. The divorce was final, and there was no turning back. As I walked out into the bright sunlight, a strange sense of relief washed over me. The weight of our broken marriage had been lifted, and for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine to navigate, free from the chains of betrayal and mistrust. The journey to healing and self-discovery was just beginning, and I was ready to face it head-on. It was time to rebuild my life, to find peace and happiness on my own terms. And with each step I took, I knew I was moving closer to a future where I could finally be free from the shadows of the past. The days following the finalization of our divorce were a blur of conflicting emotions. I felt a strange mix of relief and grief, freedom and loss. The chapter of my life with Sarah had ended, and it was time to turn the page and start anew. I moved into a small one-bedroom apartment downtown, far from the suburban life we had shared. It was modest but comfortable, a blank canvas for my new beginning. The first few weeks were challenging. I found myself waking up in the middle of the night, disoriented and reaching out for someone who was no longer there. The emptiness of the apartment echoed my solitude, but I knew that this was a necessary part of the healing process. I threw myself into work, taking on new projects and staying late at the office. The routine was comforting, providing a sense of stability in the midst of chaos. I also began to reconnect with old friends, people I had lost touch with over the years. They welcomed me back with open arms, offering support and a distraction from my thoughts. We went out for drinks, watched games, and reminisced about the past. Their presence reminded me that I wasn't alone, that there was a world outside of my failed marriage. Therapy became a crucial part of my recovery. Dr. Ellis, a patient and understanding therapist, guided me through the labyrinth of my emotions. Our sessions were intense and often painful, forcing me to confront the anger, guilt, and sadness that I had buried deep inside. Dr. Ellis helped me see that while Sarah's betrayal was a significant factor, the breakdown of our marriage had many layers. I had to come to terms with my own shortcomings, my failure to recognize her unhappiness, and my role in the erosion of our relationship. "You're doing well, Jack," Dr. Ellis said one afternoon, his voice steady and reassuring. "It's important to acknowledge the pain, but it's equally important to forgive yourself. You're human, and humans make mistakes. The key is to learn from them and move forward." His words resonated deeply. Forgiveness, both for Sarah and for myself, was the only way to truly heal. It was a slow process, but with each passing day, the anger began to fade, replaced by a cautious acceptance of the past. As the months went by, I started to rediscover myself. I took up photography, a hobby I had always enjoyed but had neglected during my marriage. I spent weekends exploring the city, capturing moments of beauty and serenity through the lens of my camera. Each photograph was a testament to my journey, a visual diary of my path to recovery. I also joined a hiking group, eager to reconnect with nature and challenge myself physically. The hikes were exhausting but exhilarating, each step a metaphor for my progress. The fresh air and stunning landscapes provided a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in years. I made new friends within the group, people who shared my love for the outdoors and who understood the value of starting over. One of these new friends was Emma. She was vibrant and full of life, with a smile that could light up the darkest room. We hit it off immediately, our conversations flowing easily as we hiked through forests and climbed mountains. Emma was also recovering from a broken relationship, and we found solace in each other's company. We shared our stories, our struggles, and our hopes for the future. As we spent more time together, I felt a connection growing between us. It was different from what I had experienced with Sarah. Simpler, more genuine. Emma wasn't a replacement for Sarah. She was a new beginning, a chance to build something from the ground up. I was cautious, taking things slow, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of happiness. One evening, after a long hike, Emma and I sat by a lake, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The moment was perfect, a snapshot of tranquility. Emma turned to me, her eyes reflecting the fading light. "Jack, I've been thinking. We've both been through so much, and we've come a long way. I really enjoy spending time with you, and I think we could be good together." Her words took me by surprise, but they filled me with warmth. "I feel the same way, Emma, I really do. I think we owe it to ourselves to see where this goes." "Oh." We shared a quiet smile, the unspoken promise of a new beginning hanging in the air. It wasn't going to be easy, but nothing worth having ever is. We had both been broken, but together, we could start to mend. As the weeks turned into months, Emma and I grew closer. We supported each other through the ups and downs, celebrating the small victories and comforting each other during the tough times. Our relationship was built on trust and mutual respect, a stark contrast to the deception and betrayal I had experienced with Sarah. Life after Sarah was a journey of rediscovery and healing. I learned to forgive, to let go of the past, and to embrace the future with open arms. The scars of betrayal were still there, but they no longer defined me. They were a part of my story, a reminder of the strength and resilience I had found within myself. Looking back, I realized that the end of my marriage was not the end of my life. It was a painful chapter, but it led me to a place of growth and self-awareness. I had faced my darkest fears, navigated through the storm, and emerged on the other side stronger and wiser. Emma and I continued to build our life together, one step at a time. We traveled, explored new places, and created memories that were uniquely ours. Our love was a testament to the healing power of time and the human capacity for resilience. In the end, I found happiness not despite my past, but because of it. The betrayal, the anger, the heartache, they were all part of my journey, shaping me into the person I had become. And as I looked towards the future, I did so with hope and a renewed sense of purpose, ready to embrace whatever life had in store.